What is up, everybody? And because I'd say it was a relevant fight week, but because the biggest news of the week pertains to Canelo, we're going to start with the Canelo stuff. And the Canelo stuff is as such. Earlier this week, basically just a lot of reports. So it was like report. It looked like he was fighting Jake Paul. It was kind of frustrating a lot of people. Then Turki Al-Sheikh out of nowhere says he signed a Riyadh season deal, 4-fight deal. And then yesterday he said Canelo will fight William Skull May 3rd. It's a Saudi-backed card. There's a lot to unpack here. First off, Canelo appearing to do a Riyadh season deal, which sets the stage for a Terence Crawford fight, but also what the heck does Premier Boxing Champions do? Because they're really not putting on a lot of shows. They had a great show with Benavidez. They've got a show with Gervonta Davis. But it really felt like their next marquee show that was going to be on pay-per-view was going to be Canelo versus whoever it was. And now that's probably not happening. We don't know. And there's two ways to go. Like, what's Canelo doing? And PBC. Dakota, I will throw it to you for you to talk.
Well, I think the first thing, too, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed like the first fight that was being reported on or rumored was Crawford and Canelo, which has been happening for quite some time now. And then it looked like that fight was confirmed for September. And then it came out that he was going to fight Jake Paul in May, which just doesn't really make any sense for a guy like Canelo, particularly as an active fighter. I'm also more and more increasingly becoming of the mindset until there's a presser or until there's some kind of event announcing a fight, I'm not really taking it too serious because it feels like the internet sort of, tosses something out to see what the reaction is. And I can't tell if that's who exactly does that, but it does feel like Ring Magazine has been throwing leads out to see like what's the reaction to this. Because it is all kind of tied together, right? They're owned by Riyadh season. So I think the reporting on this has been a little odd. And now we know that Canelo's first fight on this deal is going to be with William Skull. He's got the IBF title from, I would say, a bad decision against Vladimir Shishkin, but nonetheless, he is the champ. And all things being equal, right? If we were 100% a sport, this is kind of who you'd want Canelo to fight. You'd want him to fight the only other guy with a world title belt, even if in this instance it's a sort of unexciting opponent. In theory, that's who he should fight.
Yeah, I mean, it's just frustrating. We got our guy Joshua Cabrera quick to jump into the chat. Salute to Lukey and Dakota. I'm hearing Top Rank offered Abdullah Mason to Gio Cabrera for April. How about that? We got a breaking. We're gonna get to that, Gio.
Fight.
That's a real fight, but and bro, shout me out, Real Gaming. We're not sure if you're AI or not, but you're getting the shout out. We got you your shout out, Real Gaming. So you're shouted out. The sequence of events, right? So it's like we're building to this Canelo Crawford fight, which to me, I feel as though that's kind of the end for both guys. Like where do they go from there? Like for Canelo, maybe he does one or two more fights after it, but that's it.
Well, based on the deal, he'd have two more.
But I almost get the sense that it's like, okay, maybe there might be a rematch if the fight's close. And then maybe there's one more fight that could be out there, a Benavidez or something that the fans really want, overpay for it. But it feels like the Crawford-Canelo fight is going to be Canelo's own version, but in a different way of Mayweather-Canelo. An exciting fight where I think things are going to be weighted in Canelo's favor because of size, but people are going to be excited about the bout because it's a compelling big-name matchup. I don't think Crawford fights again if that fight were to happen. But I think what we're also speaking to is the race to be first. And this is a media thing. So Canelo gets a lot of views. Jake Paul gets a lot of views. Crawford gets a lot of views. But
Crawford definitely gets the least of the three by far.
For sure, but I mean, when you mention his name with Canelo, I think people go, that's an interesting fight because there's so many paradoxical things about it. And we live in a world where people are so hungry to be the first. So they want to get it out there. And what I'm noticing from whatever standpoint I have in the media section, there's a weaponizing of the media, knowing that people want to be first, where you have to be very careful about what you're going to say and when you're going to say something's done, because I'm of the belief of you. I'd rather move too slow and get a press release than push something quick and then have to go, okay, the deal wasn't completely done. And I know that that's not exciting and that doesn't make me a newsbreaker because I move too slow.
But it also means that you're not pushing inaccurate things.
And it just feels like with Canelo, the views and the money are so much that people want to be the first to get it. They want to break the news. And it's created this weird thing where I'm not even that interested in this part of it, but I'm still not even comfortable saying that William Skull is going to happen and Turki Al-Sheikh has confirmed that fight's going to happen. I want to see a presser. I want to see a press release. I want to see a press conference because there's just too much stuff on the internet saying stuff.
100%. And also just in terms of people on the internet saying stuff, to go back to one of the things you said about this kind of being maybe the end for both fighters in being Crawford and Canelo. But what I read, and I believe it was from Mike Coppinger's report, but somebody on ESPN reported that the other opponents for the last two fights that are being talked about are Hamza Shiraz, Chris Eubank, and Dimitri Bivol. So I think should Canelo win and win impressively against Crawford, there's 1 to 2 more meaningful matchups left in his career. And I think the Bivol fight is appealing whether or not he beats Beterbiev in this second fight because Bivol beat Canelo so wide the first time.
Got our guy Justin, who we haven't seen in the chat before. Who do you guys want to see the Canelo undercard? I'd love to see Bam versus Puma on there. I mean, I'd love to see Bam on a Canelo undercard for one of these super fights because he's pretty obviously one of the best fighters in the world. And to get him in front of that Canelo audience could only do good things because we need our relevant young fighters in front of as many boxing fans. And with boxing now not on network television and it's becoming more destination television as opposed to I stumbled across a boxing match, we need our big names to kind of propel up our future stars or current stars.
Hey, listen, Chocolatito had Triple G, so I see that as a perfect kind of partnership.
Okay, and final thing, where do you see the PBC in this? Because if we don't know if they're involved or not, but let's say they're not able to do a standalone pay-per-view, kind of inactive. We're waiting on the Fundora fight to get announced. We believe that Fundora versus Cordell Booker is going to be announced soon. But where do we go from there? Like, what do you expect from PBC? What fights can they make to kind of have?
I don't even know who they have anymore, Lukey, to be honest, because they don't do any kind of developmental shows. So, I know kind of the bigger names and offhand who I've seen on their cards lately, but they're not particularly developing any new talent. So I don't know. I don't really know. I don't know what their plan is moving forward, but it does feel like increasingly that they're just kind of getting left behind.
Well, I think that PBC, for you and me, hardcore fight guys, and then we'll get into fight talk, right? We really like watching development. We like seeing undercards, and it's pretty clear PBC's model is not for Luki and Dakota. We can't sit for a whole afternoon and watch these guys like Daniel Blancas and see where they're going to be. And they're not running those kind of mid-card shows where a guy like Ramos Jr. gets to headline anymore after the Fox deal. They've kind of gone like big stars and bust. That's it. And I think that for us, where we're watching the ProBox TV cards, we're watching the Salida cards, we're kind of feeling we're seeing ourselves pulled away from it. I feel as hardcore enthusiasts because you're only getting these big fights and they're only coming every 2 to 3 months. And there really is just a small window of fighters where in the current landscape, we're just seeing a ton of fighters on a ton of platforms where we get to pick a la carte who we're drawn to.
Right.
And I just think that it's a difficult model because it almost speaks to a more casual fan who wants you to choose who to watch rather than now I think fight fans want to choose themselves.
Well, beyond the choice element of it, I don't know how you sustain that long term if you're just sort of committed to this current generation of big name fighters. I don't know how you build what's next.
Yeah, it's a strange one, but I feel like they go hand in hand because if Canelo's not fighting on a PBC card in May, it begs the question of what's the next big one because they kind of have had these dates you can circle, and especially if last year Canelo was a big part of the PBC scheduling on Amazon Prime Video. So if he's not in that rotation per se, who fills that void? Does Benavidez go into that spot? I think it's a something we need to discuss because it's very interesting to me. Let's go into the fights. Derek Chisora beats Otto Wallin. You basically called this fight.
Yeah, I mean, listen, bro, it's so wild to watch these fights take so much out of Chisora, and you're thinking there's no way he's got one more of these left in the tank. Even these last couple that he's winning, bro, you can see at the end of the fight how much of himself he's putting into the fights, and he's taking, shots from guys that are taller than him, and it's just incredible. It's incredible to watch a guy with his kind of record just have so much will, been in with a who's who of his time, and I think was just still awkward enough and still had a different kind of timing on those looping shots where Wallin just couldn't get comfortable letting his shots go regularly, even though he won some rounds down the stretch. Chisora still with the sneaky timing, still with the sneaky head movement, and still able to out hustle guys who clearly have kind of more gas in the tank than he does, but don't have the desire the way he does.
Yeah, I also think that there's a thing that you hit on very astutely that Wallin just doesn't handle physical fighters well. This is a guy who has a very European style. He's good at kind of fighting at a certain speed. And when guys push him forward or push him back, he was looking for counter punches to kind of slow the fight down. But he was never able to dictate the pace. And I thought maybe he was going to take Chisora into the second half of the fight and pick it up. He never got out of that first gear. I think the cynic in me almost feels as though he was sparring in this fight. The not cynic in me thinks he's a European style fighter who's struggling to adapt to that professional style. He has kind of an amateur style where he wants to keep the distance. And on the inside, Wallin simply has some flaws, in my opinion.
Well, and a lot of heavyweights don't fight on the inside the way that Chisora does. I mean, there are some, it's awkward and kind of plodding and slow as he is. There are some things he does really well, and he throws combinations with a certain type of creativity when he's right in your chest that a lot of these taller heavyweights are not going to throw. So he's able to out hustle some of these guys.
What did you think about the fight as a whole? I know for the UK fans, it was a really exciting one because they really liked Chisora, but really kind of like an anticlimactic fight for me. If I'm being objective, it was Chisora's will overtook the fight. We never got that second gear for Wallin. So the pace he started at is the pace he ended at. The most iconic thing was him getting dropped with the overhand right. Chisora took way too much damage. Once again, getting cut. Just kind of a strange. I think that the best case scenario is this is a send off for Chisora, but it feels like a guy with the fighting spirit of Chisora. It's just hard to get him to say a fight is his last fight.
Yeah, I mean, they were already, it was like both the retirement party and also what are you going to do for number 50? So they're kind of talking out of both sides of their mouth on that one. And I just, there was there was some strange things about this card in terms of the broadcast, but one of the really strange things was cutting to his dressing room hours before the fight. And he was like having a complete meltdown, bro. I mean, he was in tears. He couldn't contain himself. And I don't know what that was like in reference to, but it does feel like it's something that he can't let go of, even though it's obvious that although he still has the will and the ability to win against a certain level of fighter, it's like I don't need to see him fight Martin Bakole, bro. That I feel like he could really take some damage. I don't need to see him fight Agit Kabayel. Like I don't need to see him in these like truly dangerous, hard matchups anymore. He may be able to beat an older Joe Joyce or an older Otto Wallin, but it also feel like this has the potential to end in a not so pretty fashion for him.
Not sure I understand your comment, Fresh BX. Derek Chisora plus 175 equals shush and money.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't understand gambling talk.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a gambling. I was thinking like the light heavyweight division, so I didn't really know. Money motivated, great username. What's your guys' prediction on Hamzat Shiraz versus Carlos Adames? I guess we can give him a little quick preview right now because this fight card didn't have much on it. What is your initial thought, Dakota, going into?
I mean, my initial thought, particularly considering Adames's last performance against Gaucher, where he just really didn't let his hands go, I think that Hamza is going to dominate that fight, personally.
Yeah, I think the same. I think it's a similar thing. We'll get into it next week. Undercard, there was a couple of notable things, but not really that much. Did you see anything on the undercard that stuck out to you?
I watched the majority of it. There's a lot of new names on there for me, so I'm going to pull up the box rec on this one. I do remember that I believe it was Rafferty who won the last undercard fight. I was pretty impressed with him stylistically, just in terms of how he maneuvers in the ring. Doesn't look like he has the athleticism or the explosiveness to really hang at like the top level, but a pretty good IQ guy.
Yeah, my friend Sean, that I do a podcast with from the UK, he's high on Rafferty. It feels like the Demolition Man, Rafferty, is going to be a guy in the mix, but he probably won't make that jump to the next level. The fight that I really was looking at, that I thought was something, was Sofiane Kati defeating Nathan Henney
Crazy.
after beating Denzel Bentley, which I think is still a top 10 middleweight given the current division. Thoroughly dominated and demolished him. I didn't see that happening, and it almost makes me wonder, do we have a guy at middleweight? Is this a guy that can emerge and be just a random person that we just undervalued, didn't have a great record, comes, gets a win on this stage, and then takes maybe some B-side fights, and we start to have a new player in the division? That's what I saw on this undercard.
Heaney started off pretty sharp, but yeah, it seemed like Kati clipped him and hurt him a couple of times and was just patient enough. I didn't see anything from him in terms of like a consistent output. I still don't really know what type of fighter he is, but he's a guy who has a decent skill set and can hang around and stay engaged even in fights that he's losing. So that was a super impressive performance for sure.
Yeah. Then we go to ProBox TV.
Let me ask you something real quick, though,
Okay.
Lukey. One thing that I didn't understand about this broadcast, how come there was such large portions of it that were muted? Like they would even cut to like, let's go into the locker room and talk to this guy, and the whole interview is muted. And then they go to this other thing, and the only thing that wasn't muted the whole time was the commentary. And it was a super odd thing to watch. And then you have them with Chisora on camera in tears. That's not muted. You have Jack Rafferty and I can't remember one of the other guys from the undercard, but we're having like a pretty personal, like celebratory moment. That wasn't muted, but everything else is muted. Did you understand the broadcast situation here?
So for me personally, the only thing I can think of, and I don't know if this is true, is it was probably another distributor distributing the fight locally, and then there was a form of distribution rights. So it was probably what you might call a dirty feed. So someone else they're paying a licensing fee or a distribution fee to get the fight, and then it's a signal coming in, but not everything gets to be shown on the international telecast in certain markets because of the distribution deal or whatever. That's the only thing I can think of.
Well, it's not a great way to watch a card, and also the whole time on, any schedule that I've seen, there was no network listed for this fight, so it was obviously something that was kind of last minute. I honestly was assuming that I wasn't going to be able to watch it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I think as we do more streaming cards and the sport becomes more global, U.S. fight fans have to realize that we're not always going to be the priority. There's not always going to be a clean telecast built around us. And it's like they're giving us the fights, but, some of these fights might not turn as much of a profit in the U.S., and you might just get the fights, and it might just be what it is. And that's just, I think that's the nature of the beast. Who knows how that evolves, but I think that this is a very UK-centric card. It mattered to the UK. It didn't matter as much to the US. And I think that the telecast was kind of like, okay, if you like this card, you probably are a fight fan. You're probably okay. It reminds me of like kind of some of those cards we'd get a little after the pandemic where they just would film the ring, and it would just be the ring, and then we cut back to a camera. It is what it is. But that's my thoughts.
Just figured I'd throw it out there. Didn't know if anyone had any answers on that.
Okay. Thoughts on the ProBox TV card?
Hell of a card, bro. A lot of fights. I don't know if you want to start with the main event, but so some real kind of like star-making performances on this one.
For me, the standout was Justin Paleto. Shout out my guy Adrian Clark and Jolene Mizuni. Paulie Malignaggi brought up a great point that he's been a bit inconsistent, but if he fights like this, now you once again, just to big you up because you had a great preview last week, we should really go double down on you. You did a great job last week in breaking this down because that 30 to 35 jump is a big jump. And that was something I noticed was just a style where you are reckless and take punishment. It doesn't work in those big jump weight classes as much if you're not as reckless and the power doesn't translate. So that you saw that accurately. The other thing I saw was Paleto used distance, timing, reach, and really sharp shots, unlike I've seen him in other fights at this level before. And I think he made himself into a real contender. And by the way, a fight we'll probably preview in a bit. Miguel Madueno holds a win over him. Madueno's now stepping in to fight Oscar Duarte. That's a fight. Like, people are sleeping on that.
Yeah, but I gotta be honest. And I didn't see that fight. It's so hard for me to imagine Madueno beating this guy. That's like almost unfathomable to me. There's no disrespect to him, but Rakhimov is a pretty high level pressure guy. And Paldo just seemed like he found his range immediately. He never set enough, to really let Rakhimov sit down on his shots. And beyond just outboxing him, he beat him up to the body. He really didn't take a whole lot in return. And so even at the midway point of the fight where it's like, all right, maybe Rakhimov can get something going here, he was already too deep in the tank in terms of, how much punishment he had taken. So incredible performance for him. Some really nice boxing, both going backwards and then kind of becoming the aggressor, and a really brutal knockout. A nightmare performance for Rakhimov, bro. I don't know where you go from there after a fight like that, where it really looked like that fight not just looked bad on him as a boxer, but it looked like it took a lot out of him physically.
It's just not, and I think he's coming off of, correct me if I'm wrong, 2 knockout losses now. I think he lost to Sugar Nunes as well, but it's not listed on his box rec of all things. Someone was telling me. I'm trying to confirm that, but I think he had a fight with Sugar Nunes, and if that's the case, so he has a loss to Sugar Nunes last year, and that was a TKO loss. So 3 losses in a row, but 2 stoppage losses. That's a lot of damage with a guy that has a blue collar style. I don't know. Who knows? Like, we're living in a world where like it's just there's a lot of ambiguity. But I noticed that wasn't on his box rec, but he lost 3 fights in a row.
That adds a lot of context though, because for me, if his last fight is a close decision to Joe Cordina 2 years ago, that's a whole different thing than he's coming off of another knockout loss.
Javier Avila explains, because it was an IBA event. So I'm not really sure what the IBA is, but apparently IBA events are harder to get on BoxRec for some reason. So I'm not sure why, but that shout out to Javier in the chat for explaining that to us. BoxRec doesn't recognize it or those events, which is kind of annoying, right? Because you want like records that are just easy and simple to get. But now there's this whole political nature of boxing where now it's just strange, but we don't have to get into it. That's not fascinating. So he's coming off a knockout loss. And in this fight, he just looked, I think even at the weigh-in to me, he looked a little drawn out and he didn't really look in great shape, to be honest. He looked kind of, and then you looked at Paleto and he looked like a bodybuilder. He looked
like a
shredded.
welterweight also.
And I think that's, so the story of this fight is kind of how Madueno beat Paleto. Madueno is a big guy for 135, 140. Paleto was big compared to Rachmanov. I think that all of these guys struggle with bigger guys. I think Madueno was able to be a bigger guy who those same punches did not affect the same way, and he could just go forward. And Paleto, if he can't keep you off, there's a level of what the heck is going on. And I think Rachmanov needs a level of physicality for his style to work, or else he's just going to be taking shots.
Yeah, and he was not able to get any of that. Shout out to Justin Paul, though, who I think really announced himself as a serious guy at lightweight.
Main event was a good one. Ramon Cardneas beats Bryan Acosta to get off the canvas. Kind of a fun puncher fight. Bryan Acosta reminds me of like a Miguel Mariaga, long, lean guy who has probably more power than you think, tricky guy. Impressed me that he was trying to punch with a puncher. Cardneas, you can tell is a puncher. Because
who's he remind you of, bro? I'm curious. If
Ramon
you thought of this
Cardneas?
Yeah, who's he remind you of?
You know, I haven't really thought of it. Who does he remind you of?
To me, he's a spitting image of Luis Neri, bro, where he's got like a lot of the boxing ability and the athletic ability that we see in the first half, but there's something in him that can't help but get into a scrap, at least in the back half of the fight. So you see the talent, you see the ability to kind of fight in any style, same way as Neri, but you also see that inability to maintain the game plan. It's like Neri's boxing so beautiful early against Hovhannissian, then it gets dragged into a fight of the year. And this kind of wound up being, I would say, pretty similar.
You know, now that you bring it up, that's very true. And it makes me want to see them fight each other for a belt.
It'd be a fun fight. I really think they're really similar. But that being said, I think that Neri is a much bigger puncher than this guy. They kept referring to him as a puncher. I'm not sure I see that. I'm not saying he's a feather fist, but I don't necessarily see him as like a walking knockout. Whereas with Neri, he put Inoue on his ass and I think could knock anybody out any given night. But that would be a fun fight.
I think he has thudding power, but he doesn't have like maybe that one punch power. But I think the reason he's being referenced as a power guy is you look at it and he has the temperament of a power guy to me, where he's like looking for one shot at a time, loading up on shots, punches,
he's very
all
accurate
that stuff.
And he's very accurate.
Dan, the boxing man, jumping in. We haven't gotten there yet. We're breaking down the ProBox card. We're just about to get to the Keyshawn Davis-Denys Berinchyk card. So just let us finish this ProBox card, and then we will be right there. Thank you for joining Dan, the boxing man, who's a big force on X. Yeah, to me, Cardneas, I think the power, you can tell he hits hard to me because he doesn't always set his shots up. He's looking for a big right hand. He's looking for a left hook, jab, big, and they're kind of all one speed, which I think kind of hurts him in the second half of the fight. His guys start to time him in the second half, and when he starts to slow down, I didn't really see him, change gears. There weren't like, hey, let me step over and do this or do that, and that kind of opened the door for, I think, Acosta to want a left hook with him.
Well, credit to Acosta, once he found his range, he was not hesitant about really letting his hands go and trying to, make it uncomfortable for Cardneas, because he had to know that he was behind. I mean, he had to have lost at least the first 5 or 6 rounds clean. So there's no way he doesn't know he's deep in the hole. And, he drops him and he makes a hell of a fight out of it. Definitely want to see Acosta fight again.
Doesn't he kind of remind you of Mariaga a little bit, where it's like, here's a guy who's like a
Yeah, maybe
professional guy.
Mariaga, maybe like Rocky Martinez a little bit too.
Yeah, like it's like the only guys that are going to beat Acosta are going to be like professional top 10 guys. And he's totally there to upset a guy. Like if you think that if you overvalue your skill set and you have a fundamental flaw, this is the guy that's going to take you into round 6 or 7, because he did it to Cardneas in this fight. He took him into the late rounds, caught him, dropped him, and made it a real fight because Cardneas has some flaws.
I think he also got better as the fight goes on, which not everybody can do.
He's a tricky guy. You know, I wouldn't be surprised if he's in a title eliminator at some point. We're doing this show and you say, you know.
One thing I didn't understand also, and we're getting more into the ambiguity of boxing, but these are the things I look for, right? And if I'm looking at them, I'm sure I'm not the only one. Was this a mandatory or a fight to become the WBA mandatory? Because as far as I know, Cardneas is ranked number 2 in the WBA. He's got some kind of international Fugazi belt, but you would think that, you know, he would become the mandatory in theory.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. I think MJ, our guy MJ, is the mandatory in that division. But once again, I should do research because
he's not. He's not the number 1 at the WBA is vacant.
So what's MJ's number 1 ranking that he currently is?
I believe the WBO. So I'm looking at the WBA rankings right now. This was a super bantamweight fight.
No. So MJ is the interim champion. So the MJ is the interim, and Inoue is the outright. So I think he gets precedent because the interim should consolidate with the champion. But once again, I get the point of the interim titles, but shouldn't that just be a number 1 contender?
Well, yeah, because then what you have is you have the number 1 spot not rated based on what I'm looking at. Then you have Cardneas at 2 and Neri at 3. I don't see why you wouldn't just have Cardneas and Neri fight as the mandatory, or MJ and Cardneas fight to become the mandatory.
Well, the issue I see is Cardneas and MJ are teammates. They train with Joel Diaz. So I'd assume that they spar together, which could create a conflict of interest.
Yeah, but I didn't know that could affect, you know, the WBA is going to cater their rankings to who's sparring together. Is that how that works?
I mean, I personally don't care, but I also feel like MJ has done enough to be in the roto to get a Inoue fight. Like, I don't think he needs to win another fight. I think he's done enough to do it. And Neri and Cardneas could be a fight of the year classic fight. So, I mean, just from whatever standpoint, like if we can get a Neri Cardneas fight, which could be Rios Alvarado of this generation, and MJ could get a fight against Inoue where he presents some skills that we haven't seen Inoue in with for at least a while, I wouldn't be mad at that, because I feel like Cardneas versus MJ could be a very good fight because we saw Taplees have a lot of success with MJ, but it could be one way or the other. Like, I don't think I have that level of excitement the same way I have for an Inoue fight. So of the matchups, that's the most uninteresting of the fights. And I think given that they've trained together, they probably have mutual respect. We have the chance of the 2 guys go in there and respect each other a little too much.
I could see that. I could also see it being super competitive for 6 rounds, and then he kind of turns off this Cardneas. Turns off the switch the way he did in this one, and MJ kind of takes over. Regardless, my only reason for asking it is sometimes I think the logistics of boxing get confusing, not just to me, but to fans who are way more casual about it to me. So sometimes I feel like getting a chance to kind of break down, well, why are these things happening? It just helps to give context. But the most important part is that this guy's ranked number 2 in a sanctioning body, and is probably close to a world title shot.
Then you got to see my guy Michael Angeletti on this undercard too. How awesome is he?
He's great. I haven't seen too much of him, and he was getting hit a lot, and I kind of felt like he might have even been losing the fight at that point. But goddamn, that was an exciting, really sudden knockout, and clearly he's a super sharp guy.
And I think also with his mentality going into this fight, listening to him in the pre-fight buildup, he was going to target the body. And the downside to targeting the body is you get hit. So I think that he's right, we watch a lot of prospect fights. This is a guy who's developing. This is a guy who's working on the way up. And I think he's getting better, but he's not quite at that Cardneas level, right? Like you can't throw him in with Bryan Acosta yet, and they're also in a different weight class, but he's getting there. And I thought that this was a big step up for him, and he passed the test.
And Flores is a good fighter. They said he Nonito Donaire Sr. was in his corner. He was a 14-3 guy who had some really awkward timing. So it was a good opponent too.
Yeah, he's a solid fighter. So that's that for this. Now we're gonna go to, hope we didn't run Dan the Boxing Man out of here, but we're gonna go to the Keyshawn Davis-Denys Berinchyk fight card this weekend, which I think is the big fight of the weekend. I believe it's Friday on ESPN. Am I right? Friday?
It is on Friday, and I will actually be at the media week. I was thrown off because when I saw it, it was like Wednesday and Thursday instead of Thursday and Friday. But yes, the fight will be on Valentine's Day.
Awesome. So you get to take yourself for Valentine's Day to there, but that's a great way to spend it for your love of boxing. Davis versus Berinchyk. So I did a preview show with our good friend TJ for the newsletter. There's also going to be some on the YouTube, etc. You can watch it there. I think this fight's a little closer than people think. I think Berinchyk has some awkward OG stuff about him that can throw off Keyshawn's timing. I think Keyshawn's going to win. If he's going to become a superstar, he's going to stop him. If he's going to... I don't really see a world where Keyshawn doesn't win this fight, but it's how he wins it. Is this going to be an awkward win where people start to say, oh, he got exposed? Is this Keyshawn doing a Gustavo Lemos where he stops him in 2 and then we're going to the rocket ship? That's kind of what I'm wondering right now. I'm not as much worried about the outcome, but I think people are really underestimating Berinchyk because he doesn't have those things that jump off the page at you, such as athleticism, hand speed, stuff like that. But I think he's like when Alexander Gvozdyk is your translator for media rounds, it puts a little bit of fear in me because that means that's your friend that you're in the gym with, and that's a high level, high IQ, high operator. What are your initial thoughts?
Well, listen, I mean, he's a part of that Ukrainian Olympic class that had Gvozdyk and Usyk and Lomachenko, and so he's coming from a stable of kind of a who's who of his era. That being said, when I've watched him, I think he's got a lot of those veteran tricks. He's a very high IQ guy. Obviously, he was able to beat a flawed but tough Navarrete. I personally think that Keyshawn will win this fight and win it wide. I just think that the way he's beaten Lemos, the way he's beaten Madueno, the way he beat Pedraza, he's not just dominating these guys, he's really beating them up. And I just don't think that Berinchyk has the firepower to do anything to keep Keyshawn off of him. And once he gets a rhythm going, it's just going to be too much for Berinchyk to handle. That's just my opinion. There's also, I would say, somewhat of an experience gap here. But in the last couple of fights, man, I feel like Keyshawn's really closed that experience gap as well. So in my view, a lot of things leaning towards Keyshawn. But, of course, he doesn't have a win like Berincyk's win over Navarrete. So it is a great fight, but I think that Keyshawn should win handily.
And just to put it, Berincyk's win over Navarrete was one of the most uneventful and ugly wins in recent memory.
But the thing was, he made it happen, right? It was a stinker, and there wasn't a lot to pick from, and the styles were kind of not meshing well, but he's the guy who made it happen, and Navarrete didn't. And so I think that in and of itself is a talent.
Yes, indeed. I mean, that winning is a talent. And I don't know. I feel like every time we get a Ukrainian, like this reminds me of Benavidez, and I get Gvozdyk had gone to a different level than Berinchyk, but I felt like a lot of people were like, okay, Benavidez is going to go in there and do his thing. And then we get a really hard, tough fight. And I want to set a reasonable expectation where Keyshawn Davis is moving like a Shakur Stevenson, like not quite like a Lomachenko, but he's really not had much kid gloves as a pro. He's really jumped into a certain level very quickly. And given the way he's moving, he feels like a top name in the sport. this year. He feels like he's going to secure a belt. But like Berinchyk is an undefeated guy from one of the best Olympic teams ever. And that still causes like a little bit of concern. The positive is Davis is with arguably the best modern American coaching staff in boxing.
Yeah, there's a lot going in his favor that including being in his home country. There's just a lot of things. Even though Berinchyk is the champ, there's a lot of things in Keyshawn's favor. But I think I'm glad that he's getting a title opportunity. He obviously deserves it. He's the number 1 ranked guy. And I have a lot of respect to Berinchyk for taking a guy who's probably 10, 12 years younger than him and really peaking.
Good morning, Mick, from there. Safu, when will Keyshawn fight somebody his own size? Dakota, why don't you take it?
Well, I mean, his last fight, he fought a guy that was 7 pounds heavier than him at weigh-in. So I don't know. I feel like he's already, Pedraza was already a 140er. I think he's fighting guys his own size. I think he's fighting contenders. Berinchyk is a world champion. So would you want him to not take that opportunity?
I also think that like hints at an underlying belief that I think some fight fans have that like guys grossly cut weight to be bigger and they forget the thing that they have to work really hard to make the weight. It's not like he's not showing it up at 134.6 and it's like it's easy. There's a level of sacrifice. There's a level of dedication. It's not just like an easy thing to come in at those weights.
It's often not an advantage,
It's often not an advantage. So I'm going to rephrase our guy Al the Pal, his comment. Ukraine are pretty much the only ones that give American fighters a hard time and last and go 12 with them. Other Europeans are not built like the Ukrainians. And then I'm going to also do an editorial. I saw Keyshawn when he came to the Houston area with Janabek. Okay, so there's some experience, but I do think there's something there that the pedigree of our guy right there talking about Keyshawn Davis or of the Ukrainian boxing team, there is a level of if the fight's getting out of hand, they know how to not get stopped as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of composure. I think composure is the right word.
Mick Lloyd says, "You look how I feel a little." Okay, I'm assuming that's me because I look unhinged. I respect that point of view. Also, thank you for being reasonable. Undercard. Let me get you to the undercard. Dakota's going to be there. We got Xander Zayas versus Slawa Spomer. Are we going to see a real fight here?
Who is that, bud? You got? I don't know who that is. Was he supposed to fight somebody else?
I was gonna do the show notes because everyone likes the quick thing, but I gotta, now I gotta jump in. So it's a mandated opponent. Let me do some BoxRec research. It's a real guy. It's a real guy. He pulled off a big upset. He's a typical kind of a European Arthur Abraham type guy. Follows you around the ring. Throws shots with you if he gets going. I don't really see anything that's going to disrupt Xander. I think Xander's a different skill set, but if you look at him, it's a 4-star fight on BoxRec. They're both 20-0. This is the type of fight that propels you to a title. Let me find you so he knocked out Milan Pratt, and Milan Pratt now is training with Bobby Benton down in Texas, and Milan Pratt is a good fighter. So this guy has a win over a guy. A knockout win as a big underdog. He's fought guys. They're in the same position. I think this is to me, Xander has a lot of elite attributes. A lot of them are like speed, timing, an ability, a boxing ability that you don't typically see at someone at his age. This is like you win this fight. I believe this puts him in a mandatory position for a title or will get him about there. But I think this is his level up to getting to that next tier of fight. I think this is a different test, but similar to the Teixeira fight, where now he's fighting a young guy that doesn't know how to lose, who has motivations of winning a title, who sees this as a realistically a winnable fight, essentially. So I think it's in the development of a young fighter. This is another interesting test for a fighter. who he got, like and I'm just talking, but with all these guys that missed the elite amateurs, right? It's really hard when you don't have those elite fights, and the 18, 19-year-old Xander missed it turning pro at 16. It's kind of hard to go all the way to a belt without having a little bit of, you got to spend a little bit more time at a certain level of development because you missed it in the amateur system. Even if the amateurs don't quote unquote translate, as some people say, you get that experience with those older fighters. To me, this is his fight to graduate him into Tim Tszyu fights, Virgil Ortiz fights. This takes him into that next tier. That's the way I'm seeing it.
Yeah, I think we're at a point with Xander. This is the best analogy I can think of. But sometimes with certain kinds of child stars, if they're actors or they're singers, they're virtuoso when they're young, kind of the way Xander was. And then that puberty hits and maybe their voice, doesn't age as well if they're singers, or they become a little awkward as actors, or whatever the case may be. Sometimes I feel like that's what I'm looking at with Xander, is a guy who was like a child phenom, who, not literal puberty, but who, moving into a man's sport now, doesn't always look like it's suiting him, even though he's got those elite attributes that you're talking about. And I think we've sort of been waiting to see, like, is this, that child phenom, or is this somebody who's going to now have a long, successful and exciting career? I still feel like we're figuring that out.
And I want to add to that is, I think a young person who the cell phone is something that matters to them, and social media is it's like currency. It matters as much as their bank account, probably. I think that they feel both the love of being a young person who grew up in front of everyone's eyes, but also the people questioning each fight and looking at the criticism and taking it to heart too much. And he has a good team and a good coach. JC is a great coach, but there's a level with Xander that we've never seen this before. We've never seen a 16-year-old who grew up in social media era go to the heights of being a boxer. So he's going to be the first one to ever do it, or he's going to be someone else's case study of what to do and what not to do. And as we move along in the development, I think that's where we start to look at little small X factors. So for me, Xander, we don't look at the performances per se. It's looking at other little X factors. How does he respond to fight week? How does the weight cut look? Because to be honest with you, he passes a lot of the superstar check marks. Mm-hmm. He's got a country behind him. He's got enough talent, enough performances. He seems like he has a good bit of power. It seems like he has the boxing ability to get to a certain level in the sport. The guys who honestly have had less talent than him have become stars at. But now, how do you adjust to that as a young person transitioning into basically a new person? He had an identity at 16, which the fans knew, and now he's becoming a man and wants to be almost like a second version of himself. This is champion. And that's where I think I want to see that adjustment, because that adjustment, it's tricky. Like with Mike Tyson, Mike did it, but that was pre-social media era. It's very hard and very few that can do that. So I personally am cheering for Xander to do it, because I think it would be a heartwarming story to see it. But I think it's one of the most difficult things to do, is to grow up in front of people's eyes, especially in boxing fans, which are confrontational and negative, and knowing how negativity on phones and apps, that's what goes to the top. So I assume these kids that live by their social media accounts, they're just seeing a lot of negatives and just seeing how that affects your development. But he has a good coach, JC, good team around him. I think he'll be all right. But this is one of those check marks where this is the level up fight to me.
I also too, bro. I think it's kind of crazy that he's still fighting at junior middleweight. I mean, there's been a couple of times, and I've seen him in person at weigh-ins, where he does look like he's struggling a little bit. I know he went pro at welterweight, but he's been fighting at 154 now for 4 or 5 years, right? And so he's squeezing a 22-year-old frame into the same weight that he did when he was 17. So it just feels like there's so many things about him where they're still trying to do like what a 17-year-old would do, and he's just outgrowing it. And so that's where I feel like the development has plateaued a little bit.
So want to know why I say Xander's a star? We spent more time talking about Xander than Keyshawn. And that alone tells you how interesting he is, right? Because he went on all these different rants, and with Keyshawn, you're like, man, this guy's talented, he should win. With Xander, there's all these X factors, and I think that kind of speaks to why there's a level of stardom to him. Is it kind of allows you to have so many different conversations about him.
100%. I also think that Keyshawn has solidified himself as such a, like a solid bet. You know what I mean? That there's not as much for me to say about him, because I just feel like every time I think like, oh, this might be a little bit of a challenge for him, it's not at all.
Let's go to a fight with a guy Connor Coyle taking on Vito Mielnicki. I think this is a real fight. It's middleweight. Vito has had, I'd say, inconsistent performances. He hasn't quite, to me, shown that he's gone to that next level. I think Xander's separated and shown that he can fight at a different tier that Vito hasn't truly shown us. This fight, to me, shows if Vito can kind of exist in that solid contender level. Because a guy like Connor Coyle, we know he's coming to win. Give us some of your thoughts.
I mean, it's a great fight, right? And I did commentary on a Reyes card a few years back, and Connor Coyle was on that card. It was a fantastic card, but Connor's definitely stuck out as a guy that was not a club fighter. And what I mean by, a lot of people know what I mean by that, but what I mean is, like, you're watching guys that are all at a certain level, and then he came out and he was at a different level than everybody else, and you can just kind of tell. I haven't seen him fight since then, right? Connor's had an odd career where his fights are not televised all the time. He's had big fights signed that get canceled. The Felix Cash fight, there was one other one as well. And
Ammo Williams.
Yeah, and Ammo Williams. And it's just been a little bit of a hard luck run for Connor. But one thing I know is that he's super competent. He knows what he's doing in that ring. And I know that Vito does too. And there's a lot of upside to Vito. He's still a young guy. Connor's 34, but he's a fresh and relatively preserved 34 as far as I know. And I like his chances in this fight. And I know he's going to be hungry for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a real fight. I think that if you tune into our show every week and you enjoy our podcast, tune in to see Vito versus Connor Coyle. And the winner of this fight should be treated as a real guy, because they're taking a 50-50 fight. The winner of this is a real guy. They're going to show us something. Don't say, oh, that guy wasn't good. This is a 50-50 fight. This is a real fight. This is a trajectory fight for both. The loser of this fight is going to have to take some tough gatekeeper-like fights to keep young fighters away from him. And the winner should go to that next level and be in the mix with the Javier Martinez and the Troy Isleys.
And listen, bro, I know that Vito's going to be the favorite here because he's a bigger name and he's younger and all the things, but Connor's number 3 in the WBA. I know a lot of the rankings can get a little goofy. We all know that, but he's a guy who's like right at the precipice of maybe being a mandatory for Lara. I have no idea if Lara would even take that fight, but Connor Coyle's just a guy, again, who's been knocking on the door of something big since I met him. And here's that opportunity now.
Yeah, I mean, there's that. So next one, Jared Anderson makes his return after the Martin Bacoli fight. He's fighting a guy I've never heard of.
On this card?
My assumption would be he has a cup of coffee in the ring. So I would assume that he's going to be, 2, 3, 4 rounds, overwhelms this opponent, and then we're looking for him to get back in a more interesting fight. I think it's really promising, though, that Jared's coming back not as a main event fighter, looking just to be busy.
He's not on the box rec lineup.
Well, he's listed on the bout sheet that I saw. So he's listed as fighting what's his opponent? He's listed as fighting Marius Kollias. So we will see fight week, but Jared should be back on this card.
Yeah, I'll let you guys know in a couple of days.
Because if he comes back, that would be a good one to see. Also on this undercard, Abdullah Mason versus Manuel Jaimes. Very, very good fight. Jaimes is someone I've known since the amateurs. He fought guys like Otha Jones III in the amateurs. And Abdullah Mason, he's been kind of passing the blue-collar prospect checkpoint every step of the way. But this is another level up fight for him. He's fighting a solid veteran. Jaimes was a little overweight, or not. He wasn't overweight, but he was fighting above his natural weight class to fight Rolly Romero. Didn't have a great performance. This is a real fight. To me, don't be surprised if you see like a 77-75 type fight in this one.
Yeah, it is a good matchup. I'm looking at who Jaimes has fought, and you got to love Abdullah. His last 3 fights fighting Luis Lebron, Mike Ohan, Johan Vasquez, and now Manuel Jaimes. I mean, damn, bro, for, a 20-year-old guy, but there's a couple of these now. There's him. There's guys like Moses Atauma, who it looks like he's going to fight Charles Martin. There's some young guys that are moving up quick, man. And Abdullah he's really getting after it. And we saw him get pushed and tested in his last fight, and he may have to again.
And Jaimes, what he does, and people probably don't know his style as well, pressure fighter with good footwork. So if he can get past those early rounds, this is a guy that we can start to learn about Abdullah in the second half of fights. So I think that if that happens, that'll be interesting to see, because I think the thing we're looking for with Abdullah is, how does he handle the second half conditioning wise? Does the team make adjustments? Does he make adjustments? We haven't really seen those nuanced things for the top of the thing, but he's kind of like Inoue in a sense, which is absurd to say, but I think there is a comparison there where he's acing the exam every time out, kind of. So even if there's a tiny bit of adversity, like Inoue had standout performances for 4 years, gets dropped by Neri, and people go, oh, he doesn't have a chin. And it's like the standard was so high for Inoue against really elite fighters. People kind of down talk him. I think with Abdullah, he looked about as good as a prospect could look in the developmental stage, to the point where one fight where he gets dropped, people are pointing to that and going, I want to be contrarian boxing guy.
Well, again, I think the difference is that Inoue got dropped by Neri, who was a top guy and was the #1 contender. This was more of a developmental type fight where, Vasquez is a good fighter, but he's not a top 10 fighter by any means. So I think that's where people get critical, is it's like, okay, in this more developmental type fight, you're fighting an older guy with more experience and you're getting clipped for the first time now. But in a lot of ways, it's like you'd rather see that happen now. You'd rather, not have him get all the way to the title fight and never had to push through that at some point.
Well, and that's where I think you and me are different, is you'd rather, I always use the word dress rehearsal for a lot of these undercard fights, but I see them as dress rehearsals. You want to dress rehearsal those big fights. And look, Abdullah's offensive, and I'd love to see him outbox people, and I think he can, but I think his temperament is like a Crawford, a finisher. And what kind of draws us to him is there's a level of, you hit him, he wants to hit you back harder. Those guys tend to get buzzed at points in their career, and you want to see how they respond to it. And I think that he passed a dress rehearsal, which maybe the average fan will go, oh, he can get hit. For me, as like a boxing guy, a real guy, I think that kind of showed some character in him. And it also gave him experience for, if that happens in a fight again, he knows how to kind of, okay, that happened because of this. And he was able to work through it. So I think that, honestly, a lot of times you get fighters that get to 20-0 and they've faced some resistance, but they've just kind of learned how to win by being more athletic, a little bigger, better hand speed. He's learning how to win in different ways. And I think that's the silver lining, is he's really being developed. And I think Brad Goodman, Bruce Trampler are doing a fantastic job bringing him up, because he's being raised like an old school fighter. They're not rushing him, but he has a chance to be something special. And I told Manuel, I talked to him this morning, credit to both of these guys. How many veterans wouldn't fight Abdullah Mason? He jumped at the chance. And how many prospects wouldn't fight a guy like Manuel Jaimes, who's got this level of experience? You got two real fighters. So tune into this fight, support the guys. This is some real fight, guys.
Couldn't have said it better, brother.
Okay.
And by the way, one of the things, just to close out that point, one of the things now we're looking for with Abdullah is, you had the experience of getting hurt, coming back, finishing the guy. What's the new thing now that you've been working on? That's always kind of what I look for in a fight like this.
The adjustment. Maybe you get to talk to him this week and ask him. That would be cool. Two guys that I want to point out on the undercard for the hardcore fans. Our guy Tiger Johnson, we're looking for him to make the leap this year. He's kind of had some flat performances over the past year. I'd like to see him jump into the mix and kind of get his name out there with some contenders, because I see the talent, but he just kind of, for whatever reason, I know he's now going to welterweight. Maybe that weight cut was what was hurting him, but he's going there. And then we have also Rohan Polanco on the undercard, who I think is phenomenal,
He's
very
exciting.
exciting. He's also making the leap to welterweight. So maybe we have a little compare and contrast of Rohan Polanco, Tiger Johnson, which might, same weight class, same Olympic class. That might be a fight down the road, but I'm kind of interested in watching these two fighters. Polanco to me feels like kind of like a hidden secret in boxing. He reminds me a lot of Carlos Adames in the sense where he has talent, but really power is what's bringing him to the dance. He hits hard. I think he's going to lose a fight, not to be a hater. I don't see him pitching shutouts, but I think he can really make, like you said, exciting fights. So that's a little nerdy thing. I'm looking deep on that undercard for that.
He's tough to hit too, bro. I mean, he's not just like a plodding, come forward, chin first guy. He's got some layers to him. So he's a super exciting guy to me.
And that's where I compare him to Adames is I remember Adames had the reflexes, the power, but he wasn't just like high guard, walk forward. It was like a lot of early Adames top rank was I'm going to come forward, slip, counter, and try to shoot right hand, left hook. It was a lot of let me make you miss and then explosive move. The problem I had with Adames early on was he just didn't put punches together. So you saw like a lot of one shot and then it was get back into position. I think what Polanco might do a tiny bit better to me earlier in his development is he puts the shots together. So he's hard to hit, but he kind of he overwhelms you. He's throwing back and they're hard, and he's made some very difficult movers early in his career just basically stop fighting.
Yeah.
I think he's a guy. I think that this is a world title level fighter.
I do too, honestly. I think he's very exciting.
Do you have any thoughts else on this undercard? Any things?
Always love a Nico Ali Walsh sighting. I just respect how with he could, especially in the modern climate, there's a certain kind of way that he could have moved through his career and gotten preferential treatment and taken celebrity type fights, but he really wants to do things the right way. He gets better pretty much every time you see him, and and he's a nice kid.
Yeah, I mean, it's good, bro. It's a good card. I'm excited for you. I'll probably phone you up either today or tomorrow to kind of give you some of my thoughts, just for people that you might interview, on the ground, the guys that you might be able to nab, etc. Other cards, Jack Catterall versus Arnold Barboza. This is a fight.
True 50-50, Bob, on that one. I mean, I really don't even know who to lean towards. Barboza they both fought very recently. So you're anticipating two relatively fresh guys. It's also two guys who have had to wait really long time to get certain types of opportunities like this fight. So I think it's going to be a high-level fight. I wouldn't expect a Gotti Ward, but I would expect a super high-level, high-intensity boxing match on this one.
I think they're also kind of looking at guys that are the same guy. Good boxers, higher output than you think, able to stink up fights, able to stop guys when you don't think they'll stop them, and guys who had another fighter in their way that kind of derailed their momentum. I think for Barboza, he feels Jose Ramirez was always in his way at top rank, and he never could quite get there. Event kind of beats him at the end of last year, and it's like I think that was a big thing for him. And then it's like now he's in basically a title fight for Catterall. It was Josh Taylor. It's like he probably should have won the undisputed title. And then it feels like Taylor's getting these opportunities and he's still in the back burner, but he had the great performance, beats Taylor last year. So it's kind of interesting that their fighting styles and careers to a certain way mirror one another.
No, there's a ton of commonalities between these two. I think the only difference is that Barboza, we've at least seen take more of a front foot position in certain kinds of fights. He's just a little more tactical with how he goes about it. Whereas Catterall, it feels like, is exclusively a back foot counterpuncher, and he's great at it.
So, hot take, I thought Regis was beating Catterall through 9 rounds, and then I thought that Catterall switched the fight. To me, I thought Catterall turned the fight in the 9th round. Catterall is really impressive, and he might be the best junior welterweight at what he does. That said, I think it's Barboza's time. I'm liking the energy Barboza went to the first press conference with. I think Barboza is going to pull this one out.
I can't call this one, bro. I'm usually, I feel like I can lean one way or the other, but there's multiple ways I could see this one playing out. I think Catterall having won the Regis fight and the two Taylor fights being, really big regionally, it feels like maybe he's had a brighter spotlight on him. He's been on bigger stages. So at least in terms of that X factor, you know what I mean? He's had to overcome bigger crowds and bigger moments, I would say.
Well, I'll push back on it because why not? Let's make contrarian content. Barboza had a terrible performance in the co-feature of Haney Garcia in a fight that he arguably could have lost. And I think that in his mind, he was thinking that he was probably fighting Devin Haney because Ryan was doing a lot of weird stuff in the build-up to that fight. But I would say that's probably the biggest crowd that any of these guys have fought in. And he probably fought the worst fight of his life in that experience. And I think that experience alone is probably going to be a positive because it probably doesn't get any worse than that other than losing a fight. Because that felt like it was like the weirdest stylistic matchup for a fight that he may or may not have been completely focused on. And it just looked really bad and weird in front of a crowd that was pretty much filling up as this fight was happening.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great point. That's a great point. He has had one go wrong and he kind of escaped with it. And that is an experience point.
And that's a talent, right? To win a fight that's ugly.
That's what Berinchyk did, right? We were talking about that with Navarrete. Like sometimes you just kind of have to figure out a way. And he was able to do that, even though it was a very, it was a close, controversial decision.
Undercard, I'm going to read it to you, and you tell me what you think of this undercard. Zelfa Barrett versus Jazza Dickinson. We got Reese Bellotti versus Michael Gomez Jr., which could be a fight of the year contender, in my opinion. That's just a lot of action coming at you. And a fight I really like, Pat McCormick, the 2020 Olympian who I loved, who's being moved super slow, is taking on Robbie Davies Jr., who that basically is saying that Pat McCormick sees himself as a title contender because Davies is a fringe contender. Any of these fights interesting to you?
Man, this is a super British card. It gets so dense with some of the UK fighters, but I will say I've always really enjoyed watching Zelfa Barrett. I have never seen Dickens. I see there's big names on his resume. Most of that is where his losses came from, but clearly he's an experienced guy. Actually, I remember seeing Rigondeaux stop him. I think it was in the first or second round a few years ago. But I think that Zelfa Barrett's like a legitimate contender. He's coming off a great win over Jordan Gill, who I don't know if he retired after. I believe he might have. But it was a great win from Zelfa. So him, I have limited experience with Pat McCormick, even though I saw his last fight. I think he's really talented. So in general, those are kind of the two guys I'll keep my eye on. Also, a quick shout out to Robbie Davies, who's fighting Pat McCormick. A hell of a fight with Lipinets last year on ProBox. I would say a fight of the year contender type of fight. A little bit up and down from Robbie Davies, but somebody that, when I've watched him, he's been very exciting. So if I see him on a card, I keep my eyes peeled.
Yeah, and then we'll jump over to the Golden Boy card. Obviously, Regis out of the fight. Unfortunate. Now, I think it's a better fight, honestly. Although I personally thought Regis was going to have a real chance in this one with Duarte because Duarte comes forward. Regis most effective, I think, when guys come to him because he's got a ton of power. Regis out of the fight. Now it's Miguel Madueno, and you've only seen, I believe, Madueno's performance against Keyshawn Davis, which is arguably his worst performance of his career. This is a fight to me because Madueno's a real puncher. He's not the most crafty guy, but he hits extremely hard. And Duarte, to me, if he's trending the way I think people are hoping, he might turn into like a Maidana, where Robert Garcia tweaks a few things and we have like a good puncher who now has a jab and can kind of be reckless, but has enough fundamentals where he makes the leap to the top of the division. Madueno's all perfectly set up for this to be a sneaky fight of the year because he's going to just come forward, hit really hard, and we could get a very emotional, crazy fight if it plays out one way. The other way is Duarte has a brilliant game plan and just kind of boxes a masterful fight.
You know, Lukey, it's tough for me to hear that, you know, Regis is unable to fight and is pulling out, and then seeing Kenny Sims on the undercard and not having Kenny get that call, get that step up. You know, he's another one like Barboza, like Catterall, like a lot of guys. He's been right there, right, knocking on the door for like several years now. And at a certain point, it just feels like enough is enough. Give the guy a big fight. What else do you want him to do?
Well, we don't know the politics behind it, right? So we don't even know if the fight was offered, if it was or it wasn't.
No. I'm not even making an implication about that. I'm just seeing him on an undercard. There's a late replacement that I know is a different kind of fight than him, but is a guy coming off a loss. Whereas I know with Kenny, you know, he's just been doing everything we ask of him.
Yeah, I think it's just hard where like Kenny is a certain style. He's going to bring a lot of athleticism, a lot of boxing, a lot of fast twitch, a lot of hand speed, things that maybe Regis doesn't bring necessarily. And I think that it's hard also to ask of the guy who's fighting to be like, hey, and we know you had a training camp for this type of fighter, but are you willing to take a guy that's completely different? And by the way, he was probably training for a guy in Kendo Castaneda who's a lot like you. So he had a full camp training for a guy that's similar. So I
hear
get
you,
where
bro.
you're coming from.
I hear you. It's a tough sell, but the man's earned the damn fight.
Well, he had the fight in Riyadh season, and then an injury pushed him off that card in November. So all things being equal, if both guys can win on this card, it's a no-brainer for Kenny Sims and Oscar Duarte to kind of have a level up fight. One guy goes up. How do you see this main event playing out?
I mean, I see it as an action fight. I know more about Duarte than I do about Madueno. You know, Duarte is fun. He's dynamic, but he's also, you know, he's dynamic in terms of the one thing that he does. But when I've seen him, he's a little straightforward. I also the one of the fights I saw of his was the first loss of his career. I can't remember the guy's name, but he was pretty thoroughly outboxed in that one.
Jezreel Corrales.
No, it was a different guy. It was a different
Steve
guy.
Claggett?
No, I'm talking about Duarte's first loss.
That would have been
Adrian Estrella. Adrian Estrella. I remember that fight. And I just remember him looking really limited and unable to adjust. So I'm not really sure what to make of either of these guys, other than that I think they're fun action fighters who are contenders for a reason, but I think will hit a ceiling with certain types of styles.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like if you're tuning in for a fun fight, this could be the fun fight of the weekend. It might not be the most consequential fight.
Agreed.
Don't you think that's a fair way to? Because I think there's a good chance.
I think it's also consequential though, not for nothing. It's like the whoever wins that fight kind of becomes like the sixth man a little bit.
Well, there's a consequence and there's a reason it's a main event, but like, I don't think you're going to watch this and look back in 5 years and say that was the guy of the era. Like you could watch the Keyshawn fight and go, man, that was one of the best of the era. You could watch Catterall versus Barboza and you could possibly say, I left watching the best guy in the division. I think this is going to be a fight where on any given night, either of these guys could beat one of those guys, but I don't think you're definitively going to feel comfortable saying this is the best guy. Kind of the same way with Maidana. Maidana has a cult audience and a lot of people that loved Maidana, but I don't think anyone, even his most hardcore fans, would feel comfortable saying he was the man for a solid period of time in his career definitively. He was one of the guys, but I don't think you could ever say this is the man that took ownership of a division.
No.
That's my definition of consequential. Let me go through the undercard really quickly.
Lukey, while you do that, I'm going to get my charger for my computer.
Okay, so we're going undercard real quickly. Darius Fulgrim is taking on Winfred Harris. Fulgrim is a guy who won the 2020 Olympic trials. Very good fighter. Excited to see him back in action. Ricardo Sandoval will be on the undercard. Kenny Sims Jr. will be taking on Kendo Castaneda. Yoel Arte will be on the undercard. Daniel Junebug Garcia, Peter Komatov, Gael Cabrera. Pretty regional level undercard. Undercard doesn't have super depth. It has kind of interesting names, but not as much interesting matchups. Say Darius Fulgrim and Kenny Sims are probably the most noteworthy. Also, the development of Joel Iriarte is probably notable too because he's a real guy. But beyond that, it's a little tough. Little tough, especially in a weekend with so much boxing going on. This may be one that you decide to go for your walk or cook dinner, and you might be in or out, or you might choose to come back to our program to get your information on. So, final segment will be the questions we missed. So, questions we missed, we are now going to take those in the comments. Let's see. And
you are muted, my boy.
Mic unplugged. So while I was trying to do the audio, my mic plugged. So that happens sometimes. Okay. So it's a tough fight for Keyshawn. Greetings from Colombia. Well, thank you. When you can, Tim Tszyu versus Errol Spence. So I guess they want our thoughts on Tim Tszyu versus Errol Spence if that were to happen.
Is that happening, or is this just a hypothetical?
Just a hypothetical, like how you...
Boy, it's actually a great matchup because it's two guys that had devastating losses in their last fight and are in need of like a rehabbing of their career. I would lean Tim Tszyu just because it feels like he's probably got a little more left in the tank, but I don't know. Maybe the time off has been good for Errol.
I mean, I think it would be a fun matchup to put some big names together. I think the sport is missing Errol Spence. I think we miss having his presence. I think that people don't realize how much of a presence he was in the sport until he left, because I think that there is a loss there.
The question just is he able to deliver those performances still with everything his body's been through?
And we are performance-based podcasts, so we have to wait and see, because we will give him the benefit of the doubt. Brock Jarvis versus two-time. I take it that he's joking and saying one time, which he means Keith Thurman. That is a fight that's confirmed. Keith Thurman will be fighting Brock Jarvis. Brock Jarvis has never stood out as a guy to me. So Keith Thurman at one time was the best welterweight in the world and arguably the best fighter in the world. I would expect Keith Thurman to win this fight, but he's been so inactive really since 2017. I believe that's when he beat Danny Garcia, that it's hard to expect anything from Keith Thurman because you just can't have these long periods of layoffs. So I would expect Thurman to win this fight, but if he were to lose, it would not be shocking because it's like he hasn't stayed sharp. I don't even know if Dan Birmingham's his coach anymore. We got to see what his coaching situation is. There's a lot of X factors with Thurman, and I also think a big thing with Thurman is, what is his motivations? Is he motivated to get a title, or is his motivation money? Because if his motivation is simply money, that's not a very good motivation at this point.
Yeah, and by the way, he had a fight signed with Tim Tszyu not too long ago that didn't wind up happening. So with Keith, until he's walking in the ring, I'm not buying it.
Our guy, Al the Pal, I knew Virgil was going to have a hard time with Surai Boachuk. Found out the Ukrainian was like, man, this ain't an easy win. So Al the Pal is basically doubling down on basically if you fight a Ukrainian fighter who's world ranked, you're not going to have an easy fight.
You're in deep.
Agility, nice with Xander, 154. Tim Tszyu maybe on Fundora undercard. That's like a rumor. How the tables have turned, it should be Tim versus Fundora too. That's what Mick Lloyd thinks.
I would love to see that fight, but Tim kind of made that less interesting by getting dominated by Mortazaliev.
Yeah, it's the thing with Keyshawn is already worried about the future. Denny's has a chance and is also a champion. Do you think that Keyshawn is looking ahead?
I'm not sure. I'll have a better answer for you in a couple days, though. Okay.
Canelo's stopping Bud. Bud fans mad. They really don't want this fight. They're arguing on panels. Shouldn't Elijah Pierce just fight Segaway to get his back instead of chasing Fulton? I guess for context, Elijah Pierce is now a featherweight. He's no longer a junior featherweight. He's on social media, I guess, posting videos of him and Stephen Fulton getting frustrated at one another. And I don't know. Like, to me, Elijah Pierce has a lot of good traits, and he's had good performances, some questionable performances. He just needs a high-ranked fight. So I'm never a guy that loves seeing people go at each other on social media. It's just not my thing. So I'm all
That's a
for
hell of a fight, though.
It's a good fight. It's a real fight. So not Errol, Joey Spencer. Man K Crazy says Tim Tszyu is fighting Joey Spencer, not Errol Spence. I mean, that's an interesting fight, right? Because both
I like
guys,
that.
but both guys kind of were viewed as prospects at one point. Tim kind of made the jump. Joey's never made the jump fully, but
Well, he made the jump. He just got beat down really badly.
he didn't quite jump to the next tier. But I mean, it's
Jesus is the
not.
next tier?
Jesus was the next tier.
Yeah.
Because
That's what I'm
Jesus is like he didn't get to that next tier. So he kind of stayed at a certain spot. He tried to make that jump to the elite guys, and he couldn't quite do it at that time. I mean, there's a world where I could see Joey giving Tim issues.
It's kind of all up in the air now for Tim Tszyu. I mean, that last fight was just so devastating that even if Joey's not on Mortazaliev's level, you have to start wondering, you know, like Tim's got a lot of questions to answer now about what quality of fighter he is.
And he's also taken a lot of damage. So the quality of fighter you are, and we don't know how he spars and trains. He could be taking damage in the gym. You know, there's a lot of damage, and Joey's still a guy with a lot of amateur fights, a strong guy who we've never seen Joey come in out of shape, and he's a capable operator, young, and you never want to fight a young guy with a lot of experience in the amateurs, competent people around him coming to win and feeling like he's playing with house money. Like the world's expecting him to lose. It's a very dangerous proposition for Tim, but credit to Tim where he can, even when he's taking like what the fans might perceive as a tune-up fight, it's a real fight. And that's a cool thing about Tim.
I mean, it's also a credit to Tim Tszyu that he could take a loss so bad, and yet we consistently have comments, you know, in our chat that people want to hear about him, people want to talk about him, people are still, you know, very much attached to him as a fighter. I don't know if that's because we have, you know, some of our Aussie brothers in the chat, but he's certainly maintained a level of popularity, you know, in spite of a pretty nightmarish 2024.
Yeah, and then our guy Dan the Boxing Man, Keith Thurman is fighting Jarvis in March. Tim Tszyu fighting Joey Spencer in April. Winners will meet this summer. I want to throw out a question to you to end the show, Dakota. If one person were to lose, Tim Tszyu or Keith Thurman, who would you think would be the guy that would lose between those two fights?
Probably Tim, but I think Tim's fight is more likely to happen than Keith's. So that's a matter of those fights actually have to happen. It's all theoretical when it comes to Keith Thurman.
Yeah, it's really disappointing with Keith. Like, I'm a big Keith Thurman fan, but I basically look at him as a retired fighter because like he fought Pacquiao before COVID, and then I think he had one fight with Mario Barrios that's somehow now 3 years ago. And it's just
he's fought 2 times in 8 years, Bob. Like, you're not an active fighter if you fight twice in 8 years. You're just not.
I mean, that's and leading into that, well, he saw it 3 times in 8 years essentially because he had the Josecito fight. But before that,
that was before it.
Yeah, but that was 2019. That was January 2019. With Keith, it's like he had the case to be made that he was a top 10 pound for pound guy. And then it was years of inactivity to the point where Errol Spence never fought him, but passed him up.
Yeah, it wasn't advantageous. And now I think it's a real genuine risk you take if you sign a fight with Keith that you're going to put in a full camp and he's not going to make it to the ring.
Okay, Dakota, where can people follow and support you this week? Because you're going to be live on the ground covering one of probably the big American fight card for the remainder of the year, or the remainder of this month at least. You're going to be down there. You're going to be getting coverage, exclusives, talking to people and all the stuff you do. Where can people get all this content for you fight week?
We can check all of that out at ITR Boxing. Some of it will also be on my Slip and Weave podcast page on YouTube and Instagram. And as always, check me out on the Lukey Boxing Show, the biggest dog of them all, every weekend. And what a great chat we had this week, man.
And it seems like you're possibly going to start having content starting Tuesday or Wednesday. So it seems like you might be really getting some stuff for the people that are hardcore fight crazy. You might be getting stuff early in the week.
Yes, I will.
It's awesome. Okay, well, thank you guys. Enjoy the Super Bowl, and we will talk to you later.